Hey, Gaming Geek here. This episode was inspired by one of my Patreon supporters who asked that I do a review of Citadel's new contrast paints. Now, if you haven't watched yet, go ahead and click up here for my video on washes in general, and that will give you an overview of how washes work in painting miniatures. But today, what I'm going to be doing is comparing three products together. First is the Army Painter washes, as well as the Citadel washes here, the shades, and how all of those stack up against the new contrast colors from Citadel. Also, here is a nifty 3D printed holder for these Citadel pots. Go ahead and click below for the link if you want to print that out for yourself. But here I have my Untamed Beast from Warcry that I experimented using these various shades and contrast colors to try to figure out how it works best. So let's go ahead and dive in and see which of these are the best for painting miniatures. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at the four basic tones that Army Painter has for their washes. And I went ahead and based these white so that you could see each color distinctly. And so here we have Flesh Wash, the soft tone, the strong tone, and the dark tone. And so take a look at those. And I do apologize, at some of the spots my brush on primer did not get on because of the mold release, so you'll see some white spots on some of these samples. Also, they do have a range of colored tones. So this purple tone, just to give you an example, like I did in my other video, this is a Tyrannid, and I basically primed these white, and so this organic limbs is just the purple tone washed over white. And so these were super easy and fast to make, and so that's what that looks like. But they also have green and red and blue as well. Now here we have Citadel's shades, and starting from the left we have Seraphim Sepia, we have Agrax Earth Shade, and Nuln Oil, which is probably one of the most, these two are probably the most well used and well known shades from Citadel. And then here we have Citadel Contrast Colors. Starting here on the left with Apothecary White, Skeleton Horde, Gilliman Flesh, Snakebite Leather, Gorgrunta Fur, Wildwood, Space Wolves Gray, and then finally Ianden Yellow. And so here is that range. Let's go ahead and do a compare and contrast between Army Painter washes and the Citadel shades. And so here I have grouped them to what's the most similar. So this is the soft tone and Army Painter strong tone. And I think Agrax Earth Shade is sort of a little bit in between, probably a little bit closer to the strong tone out of the two. And as you can tell, there are very little difference between the Citadel and the Army Painter strong tone. The soft tone is a little bit lighter out of the three. Let's go ahead and turn this around, get a little bit better view of the tones, but pretty similar. And then the Army Painter dark tone versus the Nuln Oil is almost identical. I have a hard time seeing the difference between the two. And so the Nuln Oil might have a little bit better contrast where the lights are a little bit lighter, but overall that's pretty darn much the same. And then these two are pretty different in color, where the flesh tone is more of a warmer brown color, a sepia color, whereas Seraphim Sepia is actually more yellowish. And so these two are pretty different from each other, and so would warrant separate buys because they're based on what your application is going to be. They're pretty different. But in terms of color, it's going to be pretty similar in how the formula reacts in terms of how it shades. It's also pretty similar. Now here's where things get a little bit interesting when we compare the Citadel Shades versus the Citadel Contrast paints. So one of the amazing things here is that the Seraphim Sepia and the Contrast Skeleton Horde is pretty much the same thing. And so there is no discernible difference between using the wash versus using the contrast color. I have heard other YouTubers say that the contrast colors will not flow down as much, where gravity is pulling down. Like here you can see gravity has pulled down the wash down towards the bottom, but a little bit of that does happen here with the contrast colors as well. And so I really don't see enough of a discernible difference where you would buy the contrast color over the Seraphim Sepia. And the other lighter washes, I think there isn't, at least as far as I know, there isn't a comparable wash offered either by Army Painter or by Games Workshop. And so Apothecary White, which is here, I don't see an alternative that you can use, and there might be one out there. So if you know about it, go ahead and comment below. But this is a unique color, and it's a very subtle and light gray that is provided for white models. And then this is Space Wolf's Gray. It's also pretty distinct in color. Now I did put Army Painter Blue on the back, and you can see how the application is pretty different. And I didn't get the contrast paint blue, so I don't know exactly what the lighter blue would look like. I do have the darker blue here, and as I mentioned before in another video, I just don't think that the darker colors provide as much contrast. But here, I do think that this is a distinct enough color that if you're going for this kind of application, getting the contrast color is good as well. Now the other contrast colors that are unique is Guilliman Flesh. And so let's compare that to the Army Painter Flesh. So the Guilliman Flesh is more red than Army Painter, and so if you want variety in the flesh tones, go ahead and pick up this contrast color. I do like this color. And then these are pretty distinct. They're much darker as colors, and they have effects that you really can't recreate with a wash. And so I really, like I mentioned before, I really like the Iodine Yellow because it does provide in one coat the yellow. Again, this is on white base, a yellow with the shading, with this darker orange brown shading. Typically I will have to paint something yellow and then put Seraphim Sepia shade on it to provide shading, but this does it all in one coat, which I think is really good. The Gorgrunta Fur, I really like this color. It's sort of an orangish reddish color, and the Wildwood is a pretty dark brown, which I can use for bags or strapping. And then Snakebite Leather, I think, is an alternative brown color, a lighter color, where more of the white shows through. And so I do like these four colors in particular because they are pretty unique, and you are able to save time by doing it all in one coat. Now let's go ahead and look at the dollar value of these different colors. And so on this chart, what I have is the Army Painter dropper bottles, and they are the most cost effective. So I have how many fluid ounces each bottle is. Let's go ahead and just use milliliters because metrics is better than the English system. One of the quirky things about Games Workshop is it states here that it's 0.4 fluid ounces for 24 milliliters. That is wrong. It's actually 0.8, so that's a misprint. But anyway, here what we see is the retail amount and then the discount amount. So let's go ahead and use the discounted amount because I buy most of my bottles at Miniature Market where I do get a discount. And in fact, I did pick up some Citadel paints at my local Games Workshop, and they're selling them for $8 a bottle, so it's even more expensive than here. But let's go ahead and assume that you can get the discounted rate, and what you see is per milliliter, Army Painter is basically half the cost of the Citadel paints. And these pots are the largest ones that you're going to get at 24 milliliters. The contrast paints come in these smaller pots, which are 18 milliliters, which is the same amount as the Army Painter dropper bottles. Per milliliter, Army Painter is going to be half the price of the Citadel Shades. And the Citadel Contrast, because they're the same price as the shade, but you're getting less, is the most expensive at 37 cents per milliliter. And so my argument is basically with the shades that are the same, like Nuln Oil and Agrax Earth Shade, I say go the cheaper route and buy the Army Painter version of these. The only advantage that you're getting from these pots is I do prefer the flip lid. Almost with all of my other paints, I prefer the dropper bottles because you can just squeeze out a little bit of paint. But for shading, I like these pots because I like grabbing it straight out of the bottle. And then secondly, between the shade and the contrast, clearly you should buy the shade. So between Seraphim Sepia and Skeleton Horde, you should buy the Seraphim Sepia, the shade version of this. So you're getting a third more with the larger bottle of Seraphim Sepia over the smaller bottle of Skeleton Horde. So you should always get the larger bottle. And then when you contrast between the contrast paints and the Army Painter, like these two, which are pretty similar, if you need to pick one flesh color, clearly you want to get the Army Painter, because at 14 cents versus 37 cents, which is almost 3 times the cost of the Army Painter. So at the end of the day, if you want the best bang for your buck, you're going to want to grab the Army Painter colors. But I would say that there are enough distinct colors that you're going to get from Games Workshop that you also probably will want to grab some of those as well. In particular, the Seraphim Sepia, I think, is a good grab, especially if you're doing yellows or any of these distinct colors. The Apothecary White, I think, does work well if you do have white things that you're painting. It provides a subtle shade for them. Although if you check out my video, I do show you how you can make your own for a lot cheaper using floor wax. These ones, I'm really glad that I did pick up at least these 4 because they are different. I don't regret buying these ones. So I'll go ahead and do a demonstration of mostly using washes and the contrast colors that I just showcased to paint this figure. I did originally spray base all of these using this khaki color, but I found that it ends up making them darker using the washes and contrast colors, so I went ahead and just painted white over it because I think the contrast will come out a lot more. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Flesh Wash and do all of the skin. And this is a pretty light color, but we'll see if I can get away with just doing this and not having to do highlighting. And following the general principle of you want to do deepest colors first. That's why I'm doing the flesh. Being careful not to get it onto the fur because that's going to be a different color. Now we're going to go ahead and do all the bone in Seraphim Sepia. So next I'm going to use Gorgrunta Fur, and the figure has dried so far, and you got to be careful. If you use a different wash before the other one is completely dry, where it touches will completely run together. So I was able to do the bone color alongside the skin because there's no places where they really touch one another. Otherwise they would run into each other. So, but now that they're dry, I want to make sure that the Gorgrunta doesn't run against anything else. So I'm going to use this for all of the fur. And I'm using a smaller brush because I don't want to get it onto the skin. Like so. Alright, next we're going to use Snakebite Leather, and I'm going to do all of the bands. So next I'm going to use red tone, and I'm not 100% sure how this is going to turn out, but I'm going to do the handles of both weapons in this red. And my guess is this is where contrast paints might provide a deeper red, because this is just ending up being sort of pinkish. Or what might have been better is to do a light red here and then doing a wash with maybe the strong tone. And I might do that because look how light it is. It's way too light. So that was a fail, so I'm going to go ahead and wipe that off actually. And easy way to do that, go ahead and just take a brush and wipe it off like this. Just pick that up pretty easily. Not a big deal if you don't get all of it off, because we're just going to be painting over it. So yeah, if you have a contrast paint, that would work better because you want it to be darker. So let's try painting over it with red first, and then using one of the washes, darker washes. So this is just Vallejo Bloody Red, but any red will do. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and do red down here as well. I'm going to go ahead and do black. I'm going to do all of this rope, as well as his strapping. I'm going to need to get a smaller brush, this is too big, and his buckler as well. I forgot this spot here, so I'm going back with Snakebite Leather. Next I'm going to use Contrast Wildwood. This is pretty dark. Next I'm going to use Reaper Ancient Bronze. Next I'm using Army Painter Plate Mail Metal, and I'm touching little highlights onto this thing here, and then doing the helmet. So next I'm going to take some gray sky, and so far I have not highlighted anything. This is all washes and the contrast paint except for the black and the red, and right now I'm going to go ahead and highlight the ropes with this gray, this light gray. And so with highlighting, you don't want a lot on there. And you want to just carefully rub across like this to pick up the highlights here. And there is a lot of texture to this rope, and so it can pick up the details pretty well. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and use some strong tone and do the red. Doesn't quite look dark enough to me, so I might add some dark tone to that. And then while I have the dark tone out, I'm going to go ahead and do the helmet. Then I'll add a little bit right around here. And then the pillar down here by his foot, I'll go ahead and add some of the dark tone. So while we're waiting for the paint to dry, we're going to go ahead and put on some Sterling mud. This is the first time that I've used this, and I am super impressed. I like this a lot as a basing solution. I know that you can go the cheap route and do baking soda and super glue, but I like the fact that this puts down the paint and the texture at the same time. So even though this is a little bit pricey, again $7.80 with a discount price of $6.69, it is totally worth it to me. You got to be liberal with this stuff, so scoop up a bunch like this. And then I dry brush the base with tanned leather, which I already did here, just really lightly because I want it to be subtle. Then finally I'm going to stick some tufts on here with some super glue. I think it looks pretty good. And the key is it doesn't require a lot of highlighting. The red could probably use some banding, but I think for the most part, the little bit of highlighting that I did here on the black ropes, on his strapping, but the fur, you can tell, I think looks fine without any highlighting, as well as the banding on his arms and legs. Looks pretty good without it. So in conclusion, I think contrast colors have their place with your painting lineup as a tool that you can use, and I think of them mostly as gels, where you still see some of the undercoats peeking through. But they definitely do have a place. I do intend on using them. I think that was demonstrated with this guy here, how cool just one coat of color can do with some of the darker colors. And so I'm definitely going to be using that, but in terms of economics, it makes more sense to go with some of the shades rather than going with the contrast colors, because you get a better deal buying either these larger bottles of shade from Citadel, and then definitely these are your cheapest options with no real discernible difference between their counterparts. So as always, I think it always depends on what your application is, whether or not a product is going to find a place in your lineup of paints. But I definitely am impressed and will be using some of the contrast colors, others that you can take a pass on, but definitely will be using them to cut down some of my paint time as I continue to paint, especially Warcry. So until next time, go ahead and subscribe and like the video. Again, look down below and click on my Patreon link to see what this month's current giveaway is for my Patreon supporters. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.